Now in this section we will cover directives from jQuery plugins, or in general third-party code. So you will see an example of jQuery plugin, creating a directory out of a jQuery plugin, and you will get an idea how to wrap directives over third-party code. So let's start. Sometimes back I saw a nice slider, jQuery slider. So this is the code for jQuery slider. So this is a slider, right? It has multiple features also. For example, this range thing, right? So I kind of liked it and I wanted it to include in our project, and I'm now bored with this rating widget, star widget for rating, and I want a slider here so that I can change the ratings by sliding. So let's try to implement slider. For that let's copy 16th chapter into 17th 17 jQuery directive. So it creates a folder here in 17 jQuery directives, right? So here instead of star widget we want a slider. So let's go ahead and create the slider widget. Let's call it, let's have the file name as slider.js. uh, the definition would be boxcard.directive slider, a function as usual, and it returns a directive definition object. This is the link function, scope, element, attributes. So in link function the second parameter is the jQuery object of this selector, right? So in order to use the slider, we'll go to templates, home.html, and instead of star widget I'll comment it and I'll use slider. Or if you want it if we want to use it as a element sorry attribute plugin, then maybe span slider, right? Similarly let's also have receive points equal to book dot rating. Let's come back to our slider widget. Let's have isolatory scope, as we learned that's better. uh, Points, right? Cool. So in the directives we learned that there are three basic steps. Step 1 is initial rendering. So let's try to render the slider. Now since this is a jQuery object, and so we'll go to the sliders API, jQuery UI slider API, and we'll learn how to implement the slider. So since we can write jQuery code here, so we'll just look into some jQuery code on how to implement it. Yeah. So this is the simplest way. The selector $selector, which means the jQuery object dot slider. So let me do element dot slider. And since we have a new JavaScript file, we need to include it in and let's see the output. It won't work yet because we have not included jQuery UI file which is required. So and server is also not running, the front end server. I'll start it. So we need jQuery UI. This is a download link. So we need jQuery UI, CSS and JS. 17. So I've done HTTP server in one folder above. So let's go to 17 and then do HTTP server, and then it should work fine. Yeah. Now I cannot see anything because the sliders JavaScript file is not included. So to have that, we need the whole jQuery UI.js and the jQuery UI.js and the CSS file also. So I have the links somewhere in. So there is a separate folder called ng training. I have the links there. I'll just open it. This is the same folder. I have the links somewhere. I guess I remember on desktop. Angular training lib jQuery UI.js I have. I'll copy it. So you can also download it from internet. I'll copy this to training, Angular training 17 vendor, paste, and I'll also need a CSS file. There's jQuery UI.css. Copy this and paste this to not vendor, CSS this time. Yeah. So I'm done with the files. Now let me include the files. Let's do it with after jQuery. Yeah, and the name of the file is jQuery-ui dot main. No. The name of the file is jQuery-ui.js. So it's not a minified version. So ideally we should have the minified version because they are lighter. And similarly, I also need a jQuery UI.css. Now I suppose my slider should work. Let's see. Yeah, so I have the slider. So since the span which has this slider does not have any width, so it's not looking properly. So I'll show you in templates in home.html. Slider is used here on a span, and spans do not have width. Generally divs have width. So I'll give it some width. I'll go to CSS style.css and I'll give this span which has a slider attribute, width 100 pixels, and display inline block so that it can acquire a width. Yeah, so that's it. Let's give some margin also. Margin left 10 pixels. Yeah. So this is the, so now we have a nice looking slider, right? So this directive has started to show its colors. Let's come back to the directive definition. So initial rendering is not yet done. So we'll need some minimum and maximum for the slider, minimum and maximum values, as well as the slider should be here in case of 1, maybe here in case of 2. So initial rendering should be something like this, right? Let me increase the width to some extent. 100 is quite less. Let's have 200. Yeah, yeah, looks fine. Now let's further look into the API. If there is a feature for mentioning minimum and maximum, yeah, here it is, minimum and maximum values for the slider. And this is done by passing an configuration object. So minimum is 1 and maximum is 5. So now looks fine. Now it has become jerky, so there are 5 possible points for this slider. So let's now set the initial value depending on scope.points. Let's come here and see if there is a function to set the points. Function value, yeah, so yeah, something like this, dollar this selector dot slider value and the value. So we will use element dot slider value. It should be same as scope dot points. Let's see. Yeah, so it is at 1, the initial position. So it is at 2, it is at 4, and this is at 3, and so all the books are at their proper, the slider is at their proper place. Now if I increase the slider, so this is also re-rendering itself. So that is how a normally directive happens and directive works. So let's move to our step 2, which is one way of two-way data binding, which is so if I change the view, so the data should change, right? This should change. So let's see what events gets fired when I slide it, and in that event code I will change this value. So let me look at the events slide. Yeah, so something like this, dollar selector on slide and function event UI. So element dot on slide, a function is called with event and UI 2 fields. Let's see the values. Console.log element and UI, sorry, event and UI. Event and UI. So if I check the console, If I refresh and if I slide, so this is printed. If I slide again, so this is, line number 17 is executed every time I slide. So it has event and UI, and the new value is coming inside this UI variable. Look, value 3, right? So we will use this to set our scope dot points. So if I write scope dot points equal to UI dot value. So let's see if things work. No, they don't. I kind of expected this because I'll tell you the reason. What happens in Angular? There is a concept called two-way data binding, which we covered earlier. So whenever I change the scope dot points here, right, and this does not reflect on the view. I change the model, but so since this is changed, so book dot rating will be changed because that is linked. This is linked to book dot rating, and book dot rating was changed, but this was not notified. So this happened because the two-way data binding kind of broke, and that happened because of the fact that we are writing this code inside a jQuery callback. Now, we talked about digest cycle, and earlier, or in case we did not, Angular does the job of syncing. So there is two-way data binding. If there is a change in the view, model is updated. If model is changed, view is updated, right? So Angular does not periodically runs a cycle to check everything. For example, every millisecond or something like that. If that happens, it will be very costly on the computer, and the application will become very slow. So what Angular does, it has a list of known events, right? So Angular assumes that the data cannot change by itself unless some event happens. So only when an event happens, the data will change, and it will need to do the syncing, right? Or so the list of the events is like in some change in the input field, some option change in the select box, right, things like those, or some data which is coming from server. So there is a known list of events, and this slide, this jQuery slider slide is not in the list of the known events. So that is why uh, that syncing or the digest cycle does not run, and the syncing does not happen. So even if you change scope dot points, so that change is not reflected on the view, right? So we'll need to tell Angular to manually to especially run this to know that this code is this sorry this change is happening, and sync it properly, sync it for itself. So the code for this is, there is a function called $apply on scope. We can also write like this. So after doing this, if we do $scope.$apply, so Angular knows now. So when I slide, scope.points is changed, and now I'm asking Angular to manually sync everything, to sync everything especially for this event by calling scope.$apply. So our directive is now implemented. So when I change this model, so the view is changed, right? And when I change the view by sliding, the model is changed, right? So the two-way data binding is happening. So generally the step 3, especially in the latest versions of Angular, so which is the second way of two-way data binding, so they happen automatically. So the as the data changes, the directive reloads or re-renders. Earlier in earlier versions of Angular, uh, we needed to implement this step ourselves. So write happening by itself, something like that, right? So we have included a very nice looking slider, and this is the code, very small code, and the way to use it is even simpler. So wherever you want to use, just use span slider and the points. So we can use it at multiple places once since it is written once, and we can use it at different places depending on the need.